who cannot be seen on a slit lamp. How was the information judged?
Sir, we of the patient and make chin test on this chin rest, and in the
So you made sure that each patient is seen on slit lamp.
Yeah. We use the Hackstreet slit lamp for the information.
No, not Hackstreet, the handheld slit lamp.
No, we did not use the handheld slit lamp.
When was the intraocular pressure measured? How long after surgery?
Pressure measure after 2 weeks under anesthesia. 2 weeks and in subsequent follow-ups.
Was there any patient who had to undergo EUA to check IOP later in any of the group?
Yes, ma'am, we did in all patients. We follow up after surgery every 2 weeks, then 6 weeks, then 3 months, 6 months, measure the intraocular pressure under EUA wherever possible, and where child was cooperative, we measure the intraocular pressure on NCT.
You can even use the Perkins without the anesthesia, because when you are doing surgery, I am sure you are giving them anesthesia, and then again after 2 weeks you are doing EUA.
Yes, ma'am. So not cooperative, we do EUAs. Otherwise, we can get the IOP measured on this NCT. We measured on NCT.
The Perkins, you don't need a very cooperative child.
In fact, the age group is from 2 to 8 years,
Yes.
and the inflammatory reaction we expect is usually in the younger age group. So, but you have compared the same age group, so it is significant, probably.
We use the same the bilateral cataract because it is easy to follow and easy to compare both the eyes. Where we are doing intervention in one eye and not using transplant in the other eye. So better to compare the results in 2 eyes.
Any question from audience?
All patients undergoing cataract surgery, all pediatric age group patients undergoing cataract surgery.
Definitely yes, ma'am. Because the rate of PCO is very high, almost compared to 80-90% in children. So by using triamcinolone, it also reduces the inflammation as well as the chance of PCO are very much reduced compared to not using triamcinolone. And the studies have shown that the rate of PCO is almost nil in cases where the triamcinolone is used.
You have already done primary posterior capsulorhexis in all patients.
Yes, ma'am. But the vitreous we to cause the obstruction of the visual axis.
To ensure proper
Proper removal vitreous.
Did you come across any problems with the use of
Triamcinolone at the end of surgeries.
What lens was used?
The pressure rise is not expensive.
We use.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now with this we invite Dr. Chanchal Gupta for the keynote address. Her paper was awarded the best paper at the Pediatric Ophthalmology and Strabismus at AIOS 2013. Her paper is on clinical correlation of imaging findings in congenital cranial disinnervation disorders. Dr. Chanchal Gupta is currently working as senior resident at AIIMS Delhi, and she completed her graduation from Sardar Patel Medical College, Bikaner, Rajasthan in 2009 and joined RP Center as a postgraduate student in 2010. She completed her post-graduation under the guidance of Professor Pradeep Sharma, and her paper written during her thesis was awarded in the last year's conference. So I'm sure we are in for a treat with her interesting paper.
My topic for today is clinical correlation of imaging findings in congenital cranial disinnervation disorders. The author has no financial interest. Congenital cranial disinnervation disorders, these are defined as non-progressive, sporadic or familial disorders that result from developmental abnormalities of one or more cranial nerves with primary or secondary disinnervations. In last decade, MRI has given a new insight into the pathogenesis of these disorders, as we have come to know that these are primarily neurological disorders. And our study also aims to evaluate changes in cranial nerves supplying the orbit and extraocular muscles in cases of Duane's retraction syndrome and Mobius syndrome. In review of literature, we can see in normal subject MRIs, we can see extraocular muscle and nerve branches supplying to those muscles. In cases of bilateral sixth nerve palsy, hypoplasia of sixth nerve in both sides is documented, and splitting of lateral rectus in cases of Duane's retraction syndrome is published in American Journal of Ophthalmology. So for our study, we have included 6 cases of Duane's retraction syndrome, 2 cases of Mobius syndrome, and 1 case of bilateral congenital sixth nerve palsy. 5 subjects of concomitant squint were taken as controls. We have done 3 tests the MRI for these patients. Imaging of one eye was done at a time, and 23-degree head turn towards the opposite side of the eye to be imaged was done, so that the orbital axis and visual axis come into a same line. A point target for fixation was given. Gantry fan was kept off to prevent the dryness of eyes, and patient was instructed to fixate the target and avoid the blinking during scan time. Medium-sized surface coils were used for orbital imaging, and brain imaging was done on 32-channel head coils. This was a protocol which we used for our MRIs, and in this, as we can see, there are sequential scans of the brain stem at the level of pons, where we can see a sixth nerve bilaterally arising from the pons, seen in the contrast to CSF, coursing anteriorly, and further it enters into the Mecon's cave. And this is how we did measurements for extraocular muscles using OSIRIC software for length, area, and rim of these muscles. Statistical analysis was done by, for muscle measurements was done by ANOVA, and intergroup comparison was done by post-hoc tests. As in this case, we can see this is case of right eye Duane retraction syndrome, showing agiodivation in primary case and retraction of the globe and upshoot in attempted adduction. And in MRI, we can see left eye sixth nerve is clearly visible, but right eye sixth nerve is not traceable in comparison to controlled MRI, where the both six nerves can be seen simultaneously. This is case of bilateral sixth nerve palsy, which is showing abduction deficit on both sides. And for this patient, we could see splitting of lateral rectus in both coronal and sagittal section in comparison to controls. This is a case of Mobius syndrome, again showing abduction deficit in both eyes. In this, 7th nerve was involved on the left side. And in MRI, we can see 7th, 8th nerve complex is seen on the right side well, but on left side, 8th nerve is seen, but 7th nerve is not visible there. And bilateral 6th nerves are not traceable in this patient. And this is brainstem imaging of another Mobius syndrome patient, which is showing left bulbar hypoplasia in comparison to control, where the both pontine eminences are similar in size. So for observation, we divided our patients into 3 groups. Group 1 was affected eyes of these patients, Duane retraction syndrome, Mobius and congenital sixth nerve palsy. Group 2 was of unaffected eyes of these patients, and group 3 were controls. In statistics, we could see that for lateral rectus width, area, and circumference, for all 3 parameters, the group 1, there was severe lateral rectus hypoplasia was statistically significant in comparison to controls. And in results, in cases of Duane retraction syndrome, we could see absence or hypoplasia of 6th nerve in 5 out of 7 eyes, anomalous course in 1 eye, and apparently normal in 1 eye. In cases of Mobius syndrome, 6th nerve absence or hypoplasia was seen in 3 out of 4 affected eyes, and 7th nerve absence was seen in both patients on affected side. And in case of congenital sixth nerve palsy, absence or hypoplasia of 6th nerve was seen on both sides, the right more than left. And in extraocular muscle, lateral rectus hypoplasia, p-value significant 0.001 for these patients. And in case of congenital sixth nerve palsy, splitting was seen over the right side. And for unaffected eyes of these patients, we can see these were essentially identical to the controls, and p-value was 1 for all 5 muscle measurements. And outcomes, we standardized our MRI protocol for orbital imaging in these patients. Full protocol was not available in previous literature, and we have found that lateral rectus was significantly hypoplastic in horizontal muscle disorders and separately in Duane's retraction syndrome patients, in contrast to previous study which says that lateral rectus volume is unaffected in cases of Duane retraction syndrome patients. So our recommendation is that we can correlate our MRI findings with the clinical picture of the patient. So we should get imaging in complex forms of strabismus that may help in understanding the pathogenesis and changing our management according to that. Thank you.
Just a doubt. Actually, recently I saw a paper that even congenital supraoblique palsy is grouped under this congenital degeneration syndrome. Degeneration disease.
CCF1.
The third nerve is primarily affected, but we also have seen few patients that is was not presented in our conference, but we have seen few CFM patients also, and we could actually note see fourth nerve in every patient, so we didn't comment it in our thesis, but we saw that there is hypoplasia of fourth nerve also in few patients of CFM. So means and CCTD is also definition means it is not. I didn't see it.
Is there any special resolution which you ask the radiologist to take, or is it the routine MRI asking for the particular coronal section at points and different areas you are asking for?
Brain imaging is almost normal protocol only we were using to do, but orbital imaging we standardize the protocol differently. We have to take thin scans, 0.2 mm scans with no interstitial capping, so that we can trace the nerves all around.
The muscles. So the orbital scan you did to measure the length and area of the muscles.
Actually, our target was to see nerves also. Though we could not see these nerve branches in orbit in all patients, that's why I haven't shown that in my results. But our target was to see these nerve branches also, so that we took a thin scan without any interstitial cap.
Yeah, it is basically the radiologists are not have not yet retuned themselves to detect these nerves in the orbit. We have also tried that. And my question to you is regarding, you see, your conclusion says that this would help us in better understanding of these disorders. Perfectly fine. But what I wanted to find out from you is that did you find a difference in the hypoplastic pattern of the sixth nerve in Duane's versus the congenital sixth nerve palsy?
Ma'am, as such we didn't find any because this is supplied by branch from the third nerve, and in sixth nerve case it was not there. There was no signs of any disinervation in extraocular movements. There was only abduction deficit. There was not any aberrant regeneration, obvious aberrant regeneration. We could not see any unexpected movements in these patients. But in sixth nerve nucleus, we didn't find any difference.
Since the MRI doesn't help us in diagnosing, differentiating between congenital sixth nerve palsy and Duane's. And regarding the lateral rectus split that you found in one patient, I believe.
Yes, ma'am.
So that is not a consistent finding.
That is not a consistent finding.
And yes, so it may not be a part, we cannot conclude that this is a finding of
Duane's retraction syndrome, and by which they told that there is Sieben's theory that the nerves generate with two superior and inferior parts, and that is like they can say these two parts are not joined together. There is some disorder in their development. On the basis of that Sieben's theory, they are told that the split is there and there is developmental problem there.
Okay. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Today I am presenting prevalence of refractive errors in preterm children. Financial disclosure nil. Introduction advances in obstetric and neonatal care have resulted in improved survival of preterm baby. India has maximum number of preterm birth. Neurodevelopment impairment and retinopathy of prematurity are serious problem of preterm baby. But refractive error like myopia and anisotropy are more common in preterm than term. Methodology, it is a retrospective study. Records of preterm babies referred to our hospital for ROP screening from 1st January 2003 to 31st December 2008 were reviewed. Inclusion criteria were premature baby, preterm baby with complete information like gestational age, gender, birth weight, stage of ROP or systemic illness. And there was minimum 5 years of follow-up. In each visit, children underwent a complete ophthalmic evaluation including best corrected visual acuity, evaluation anterior segment, strabismus and nystagmus evaluation, cycloplegic refraction and indirect fundus examination. We retrospectively evaluated refractive error of preterm baby as minus 0.5 diopter of spherical equivalent or spherical equivalent. We also derived significant refractive error in young children less than 3 years based on American Academy of Ophthalmology guideline. It is shown in table 1. This is the table 1. Statistical analysis were carried out using Stata2 software. The result, there were 126 baby, that means 252 eyes, 68 were male. Gestational age mean plus minus standard deviation was 30.75 plus minus 1.99 weeks with range of 25 to 35 weeks. Birth weight mean plus minus standard deviation was 1472.65 plus minus 351.61 grams with range of 780 to 2520 grams. 147 I did not have any ROP and 83 I, that means 33% of I had replaced ROP. The retrospective analysis of refractive errors showed overall, that means in 250 eyes, in first year there was 15% incident of refractive error in prevalence, in third year 41 and in fifth year 54%. You see the table, it is p-value is very less here and it is highly significant. Among the refractive errors, 95 myopia was seen in 94% eye in the first year, whereas third year and fifth year it was 87 and 94%. High myopia was found in 13 eye in the first year, 19 eye in the third year and 20 eye in the fifth year. Anisometropia was found 8% in the first year, 16% in the third year and 21.4% children in the fifth year. Significant refractive error based on American Academy of Ophthalmology guideline found in 12% children in the first year, 18% children in third year and 24% children in fifth year, which means those percent of preterm children need glass to prevent defective vision or amblyopia. The refractive errors in regressed ROP, that means in 83 eyes, was noted and it was 28% eyes had a refractive error in the first year, 61.4% had in the refractive error in the third year, and 75% I found to have the refractive error in the fifth year. This is the table 3 showing the data. We also derived visual acuity best corrected visual in the logMAR, and in that we found that in the first year, 68% of the baby had normal vision for that age, but in the third year and fifth year, it was 28 and 50% children had normal vision. We did Pearson correlation, which showed the inverse correlation between gestational age and refractive error, and it was statistically significant, but correlation between birth weight and refractive error was not statistically significant. Discussion, our result on refractive error in preterm were more or less compatible with the result of studies done previously. Fleischer and Dobson et al. Found myopia and anisometropia higher among the preterm than term baby, which is seen in our children in our study also. Our study found myopia may or may not be associated with ROP.
Dr. Bani, I'm really sorry to interfere. We are running short, we are being talked of time, and we are being told again and again to wind up quickly. So I would request you, this will not affect the judgment, just to come to the point, that is your conclusion and wind up, right?
Limitation is it is a retrospective study. My conclusion is the refractive error like myopia and anisometropia are more common in preterm baby, and they may hinder normal visual development. In order to prevent significant visual handicap, all preterm should have ophthalmological examination including retinoscopy at the earliest and later at regular intervals.
Thank you. Now, you to introduction and the general parts of the topic. Come to your work and your conclusions. Is that right? We were handed over the hall 15 minutes late, so I think we are justified in taking those 15 minutes, and that's about it. So with that, I invite Dr. Shama Goliadi. She would talk about incidence of strabismus and amblyopia in patients previously diagnosed as pseudo-strabismus.
Good afternoon, everyone. My topic for today is incidence of strabismus and amblyopia in patients previously diagnosed as pseudo-strabismus. There is no financial interest in this study of children who have been previously diagnosed as pseudo-strabismus in a tertiary eye care center. Pseudo-strabismus is the false appearance of squint in a patient, and this usually is due to the presence of epicanthal folds or a broad nasal bridge or a telecanthus. So usually we will not ask the patient to follow up. We will just rule out a true strabismus and we shall explain it to the parents. But we have done studies, and studies have also been done previously, which prove that there is an increased incidence of strabismus, true strabismus occurring in patients who have been previously diagnosed as pseudostrabismus. Explain to them for long-term follow-up. Our inclusion criteria was age less than 5 years, appearance of squint diagnosed by either the patient, the doctor who referred, or the parents, at least a follow-up of 12 months, absence of true squint on examination at the first visit, vision acuity and ocular alignment documented at first visit and follow-up either by the CSM method, by Lee's symbols, or by the Snellen's chart as per the cooperation of the patient. Cycloplegic refraction done by cyclopentolate, tropicamide and cyclopentolate instilled at 10 minutes interval each, and stereo acuity at the last visit usually, because most of our patients were younger at presentation and would not cooperate for stereo acuity. So out of the 267 patients who have been diagnosed as pseudostrabismus, the ones who fitted into our inclusion criteria were 50, and of these 27 were males with 23 females. The age of presentation was 4 to 58 months, and the mean age of presentation was about 24 months. We had a mean follow-up of 12 months. The mean spherical equivalent was plus 0.2 diopters. We had about 10 patients with a positive spherical equivalent more than plus 2, and 7 patients with a negative spherical equivalent more than minus 2 in our study, which showed, this is at long-term follow-up, which shows that there is also a tendency of having refractive errors for which the patients need to be followed up. Out of the 50 patients who were included in our study, 5 of these patients were found to be strabismic on long-term follow-up, of which 2 had exotropia and 3 had esotropia. So this is the age of presentation for pseudoesotropia, the age at which a true squint had been diagnosed, which is a mean of 2 to 5 years of age. And we have also seen that the patients with exotropia have a more negative spherical equivalent, whereas those with esotropia have a more positive spherical equivalent. In our study, we had an incidence of about 10% of patients, that is 5 out of 50, who developed esotropia, who developed true strabismus. Positive family history had been taken for these patients, and it was seen to be about 20% in those patients who had been diagnosed to have true strabismus at long-term follow-up. There are certain studies which say that prolonged occlusion needs to be done, and that is occlusion of each eye at least 90 seconds. A study done by Pritchard and Ellis says that an occlusion of 90 seconds each will reveal true strabismus at the first visit itself, because it could be possible that the diagnosis of pseudostrabismus is a false diagnosis and we fail to diagnose certain patients who actually have true strabismus at the first presentation. But we did not perform this prolonged occlusion in our patients. So pseudostrabismus, when we see a patient with pseudostrabismus, we now have seen that there's a 10% chance, according to our study, of developing true strabismus, of which 2% had amblyopia. So a long-term follow-up is definitely required, and that needs to be impressed upon the patient's parents at the first visit itself. And as we have seen that patients have been developing true strabismus up till the age of 5 years, so long-term follow-up of at least up to 5 years, that is yearly follow-up up till 5 years, is necessary.
Thank you.
If she is not there, the next presenter, Dr. Roshini Desai, can come and present a talk on refractomy versus laser alone.
I'm going to present the refractive outcome following laser plus lens-sparing vitrectomy (LSV) versus laser alone when done for asymmetric ROP. We have no financial disclosures to make. Myopia is a known association.
Please skip the background. Please.
Additional procedure of lens-sparing vitrectomy. So we expected that the more severe ROP eyes would be more myopic than the less severe ROP which needed the laser alone. It was a retrospective interventional case series where 34 eyes of 17 infants. So we have to know here that both the eyes were from the same infant and they acted as a case and a control. The time period of the study was 2003 to 2008. We included all patients who got complete ablative laser treatment for threshold ROP in both eyes and had an undistorted posterior fold at the end of the procedure. All cases with unattached retina at the posterior fold after LSV, those who had inadequate follow-up and were not refracted were all excluded. The main outcome variable was hyperplagic refraction at the age of 1 year and then 3 years. The first post-operative follow-up was at 6 weeks and 3 to 6 monthly thereafter, and only the spherical equivalent was used for analysis. In our results, we had 10 boys and 7 girls, 6 born of multiple gestation. The mean gestational age was 29 weeks and the mean birth weight was 1288 grams. The mean age at the time of surgery was 4 months and the mean follow-up time period was 2.75 years. At the end of 1 year, 16 children underwent cycloplegic refraction, and the median refractive error in the eyes in group 1 were minus 3.8 diopter, whereas in group 2 was minus 2.8 diopter. At the end of 3 years, 12 children underwent cycloplegic refraction, and the median refractive error in eyes in group 1 was minus 5.3, and group 2 was minus 5.5 diopter. Thus, there is a definite progression of myopia from age 1 to age 3 in both the group 1 and 2. However, the difference in the refractive error in the groups is not statistically significant. Visual acuity was recorded in 7 children during the follow-up, and the mean visual acuity in group 1 and 2 eyes were 618 and 612 respectively. We know that myopia in full-term infants is due to the increasing axial length. However, in premature infants, myopia is attributed mainly to the increased lens power and the thickness and the anterior displacement of the lens iris diaphragm. The cryo-RP and ETRP studies have developed a correlation between the magnitude of myopia and the severity of ROP, and at their 5 years publication, the incidence of myopia has increased from 10% in eyes without any ROP to 82% in eyes with ROP residue. They have also said that the laser treatment had no proven additive effect on the severity of myopia. One study by Lakhanpal et al. On the effect of lens-sparing vitrectomy on the myopia, it was a study on 18 eyes of 9 infants, showed that the eyes undergoing lens-sparing vitrectomy actually developed lesser myopia than the fellow eyes which were treated by laser alone, and this difference was due to the posterior displacement of the lens iris diaphragm and the increased anterior chamber depth in the LSV group. Thus, our hypothesis at the beginning of the study were that in asymmetric IOP, the more severe eye which needed LSV will be more myopic than the other eye. And so we expected that the eyes in group 1 would be more myopic, but our data shows statistically insignificant difference between the two groups, and this can probably be considered as an indirect evidence of retardation in myopia following lens-sparing vitrectomy. However, the limitations in our study include the lack of biometric data to correlate with the myopia and a lack of longer follow-up. We also had relatively small numbers. Conclusion, lens-sparing vitrectomy may retard the progression of myopia in children with ROP. However, further prospective studies with longer follow-up are needed to establish the role of this surgery in retarding myopia. And And finally, the severity of ROP may not appear to be a risk factor for the increase in myopia. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Our last speaker is Dr. Kumar. Of computerized vision therapy in cases of standard occlusion therapy failure in amblyopia management. We have no financial interest. I will be skipping the introduction part. The aim of the study was to evaluate dimensional prospective study, and the clinical examination to the best possible was done from March 2011 to August 2011. In inclusion criteria, the patients we selected were mild to moderate amblyopia within the age group of 6 to 17 years with a red dot stereo acuity of more than 800 seconds of an arc and no constant squint, and who had failed trial of occlusion for 3 months. Computerized vision therapy with ATS amblyopia software liquid crystal BTS3 was instituted for 150 sessions, each comprising of 30 minutes of therapy at home on 5 days per week basis, and they visited our hospital every month. 15 such patients were taken up for the study, and the total time period of follow-up was 6 months. These children were reassessed at monthly intervals, and the results were analyzed to know the efficacy of computerized vision therapy at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months. Success of the treatment was defined in terms of improvement of visual acuity by 1 line, stereopsis, and contrast sensitivity. The primary outcome was 3 months, and final outcome visit was considered as 6 months. In the results, the mean logMAR visual acuity prior to the therapy was 0.46, which improved to 0.37 at 1 month, 0.31 at 3 months, and 0.24 at 6 months. After beginning the computerized vision therapy, which was statistically significant. In terms of Snellen's acuity, 6 patients improved at 3 months follow-up, and 9 patients improved and 6 patients failed to meet the criteria of success at the end of 6 months. 8 patients out of 15 showed improvement in contrast sensitivity. The mean contrast sensitivity improved from the baseline of 30% to 24%, 18%, and 14% at 1, 3, and 6 months respectively. 10 patients out of 15 showed improvement in stereopsis. The mean stereopsis improved from baseline of 152.57 seconds of an arc to 126.35, 101.50, and 81.85 seconds of an arc at 1, 3, and 6 months respectively. 4 patients and 8 patients improved in terms of stereopity by more than or equal to 2 levels of Randot chart at 3 months and 6 months respectively. 9 patients had final stereopsis levels better than or equal to 50 seconds of an arc. In a previous study by Holmes et al. To compare the near vision activities and non-near activities during patching therapy, the mean improvement was 2.6 lines for the near activity group. Previous studies have found greater improvement in visual acuity. However, all these studies have evaluated patching and or atropine and their regimens with or without near vision activities, whereas we have chosen only those patients who have already failed to improve the occlusion therapy. Despite this, mean improvement of 1.5 lines in our study can be encouraging for further trials with a larger number. Restoring binocularity in children with amblyopia may improve their poor hand-eye coordination. 6 out of 11 tasks in our therapy aimed at hand-eye coordination, improvement in which also justifies the improvement in visual acuity and vice versa. Lai et al. Also have reported improvement in contrast sensitivity function through video game playing in their studies. Improvement in the stereo acuity has been observed in amblyopia treatment study 3 of PEDIG trials. The conclusion of our study was computerized vision therapy can be tried as an alternative modality of amblyopia treatment, especially in cases of occlusion failure. However, longer follow-up is indicated to assess the regression of improved visual acuity. Thank you and have a nice day. Thank you, Doctor.
It was an interesting paper. In fact, all the papers are very interesting, but as is usual the case, we have the time constraints and we cannot enter into discussions even though do we want to. So we come to the end of this session. I think we are going to have our next session here. We already have the people in.
Yes. Yes.
Many of the papers were very good, but we have forced to choose a number 1. And I would congratulate Dr. Mihir Trilok Kothari For this paper on higher order aberration, the second refractive error is residual ametropic and anisometropic amblyopia has been rated as the first.
Sitting here attending the earlier lecture, you're most welcome to continue sitting here and attend to this next series of lectures that are going to be extremely interesting and very thought-provoking. On behalf of Toshpro Medicals and Earthly Instruments, it is my honor to welcome you all to this lunch symposium. During the next 1 hour, 3 eminent professionals are going to share with us their experience of using some innovative technologies introduced by Toshpro's partners. These technologies span the world of surgical and diagnostic ophthalmology. Let me begin with Dr. Suhas Haldipokar, one of the pioneers in India of phacoemulsification. Today, he will share with all of us his experience of using the new platform Cataract 3, introduced by Earthly Instruments. The Cataract 3 is the first platform in the world specifically designed to perform a low-cost glaucoma procedure called HFDS ab interno. This minimally invasive HFDS ab interno procedure is ideal for combined cataract and glaucoma surgery. Dr. Haldipokar has used the new Cataract 3 machine and performed some surgeries recently. I welcome him to share his experience and result of this procedure. Dr. Suhas Haldipokar, please.
First of all, let me congratulate Toshpro and Earthly for this wonderful machine and to be here to share my initial experience. Talking about Cataract 3, if you look at that machine, it's a small machine, powerful machine. Well, we have Dr. Arnab who's going to speak on the EasyTrip, but I would just mention that if I have an extremely hard cataract to operate today, if I have all the top-line machines lying in my theatre, my first choice is this tiny machine. It's so powerful. And it's powerful because of the EasyTrip technology that has been incorporated into it in the last 2-3 years. And with this, I go to my main topic about HFDS. It so happened that around 6 or 7 years back, we had a live surgical conference in New Mumbai when Earthly was kind enough to bring one surgeon, Boyan Pai, from Switzerland, and who for the first time showed us this technique. And that was a live surgery, and we were really impressed. And we always wondered why this technique is not really made popular. And Toshpro and Earthly has been kind enough to bring this technique, and I had the good fortune of doing it in the last 1 year on several patients with reasonably good results. Now, all of us know more than 50% of all glaucoma in India are open angle, where trabecular meshwork is a site of resistance for aqueous flow in majority of them. Conventional trabeculectomy bypasses trabecular meshwork, Schlemm's canal and collector channels. However, the aqueous outflow is not controlled. Post-op hypotomy and inadequate IOP control is common. Furthermore, it is compounded by subconjunctival fibrosis, which reduces the aqueous outflow. Making a controlled opening in the trabecular meshwork to connect anterior chamber to Schlemm's canal will bypass trabecular meshwork resistance and bring the IOP down, which will never go below episcleral venous pressure, and that way avoiding the hypotomy, which sometimes you're worried in a enthusiastically done trial. Now, what is HFDS? It's high frequency deep sclerotomy. Is a gonio-assisted non-penetrating glaucoma procedure wherein small openings are made in the trabecular meshwork with a specially designed radio frequency probe. If you look at the surgical treatment modalities for primary open angle, they could be penetrating or non-penetrating. In the penetrating, we know that we have trap and shunts, and in non-penetrating, we have ab externo and ab interno, and this comes under ab interno. It's also called sclerothalamiectomy ab interno. It's a non-penetrating glaucoma filtration surgery, which is new and reliable treatment modality for primary open-angle glaucoma, which bypasses the resistance of the trabecular meshwork by channeling aqueous humor directly to Schlemm's canal. If you look at this surgical anatomy of anterior chamber, you can see the trabecular meshwork, which is outlining. Below that is a Schlemm's canal, and from where we have these aqueous veins and intrasternal plexus draining the fluid. We know trabeculectomy has been there for more than 50 years. It was first described in the year 1960. It's indeed a gold standard glaucoma surgery, and we know that it bypasses the resistance of trabecular meshwork by connecting to subpalatal space. But the success rate is variable. It's from 32 to 96%, and post-op complications like hypotony and choroidal detachment is seen in up to 24% of cases. And the best part is, in spite of the experts doing it, there is no repeatability and reproducibility in this procedure. Meaning, which case it will fail or which case you will land up with a problem cannot be predicted. If you look at the complications of TRAP, we have early and late post-op, and early, the common ones are shallow AC and choroidal effusion, and in the late we have hypotony, blood failure, which is very common. And of course we are required to use antimetabolites, because without that the success rate goes down. And but the antimetabolites come with a price in terms of wound leakage, arterial erosions, and scleral thinning, and so many other problems. So there's a need for non-penetrating glaucoma surgery, which has low complication rate, minimal invasive nature, which eliminates and reduces the pressure, reducing medication which can be avoided. In the non-penetrating group that we are talking about, we have ab externo, which is basically dealing with the canal of Schlemm, where viscocanalostomy or canaloplasty or deep sclerectomy are the ones that are commonly used. And ab interno, we have the suprachoroidal space that is dealt with iStent and Goldschirms, whereas the ab interno, we have the high frequency deep sclerotomy. It's minimally invasive, safe and efficacious technique. It avoids damage to episcleral and conjunctival tissue as in trabeculectomy and conventional non-penetrating surgery. And of course, it has very low rate of post-op infection, post-op inflammation. So HFDS, where is it indicated? It's primarily for POAG, mild to moderate, not controlled with drugs, non-compliance with drugs, and not willing for topical medication are the most common patients who can be taken for this procedure. It's also indicated in a monocular patient with these large diurnal fluctuations, with this pigment dispersion glaucoma, pseudoexfoliation glaucoma, and high risk of choroidal effusion or hemorrhage, even axial myopia, previously vitrectomized eye. There's a history of choroidal effusion or hemorrhage in the other eye, high risk of post-op hypotony, young patients, and high myopia because of its nature of being extremely non-invasive and with a very minimal post-op care. But certainly it's contraindicated in angle closure, neovascular glaucoma, and in occludable angles. This picture shows you that's a small suitcase in which you see that cataracts machine. It's so tiny, you can easily carry it from place to place. In fact, in India we have, in fact the genesis of this kind of a small machine was born out of Mr. Andrea Bossard's view that India is one country will need such a small machine, because most of us are in the practice where we go from one clinic to another clinic to operate, and that's how this machine came. And on this machine, in addition to all the powerful nature of its nucleus disassembly, we also have a small a slot for HFDS, which works on high frequency. The high frequency diathermic probe, which is called EBI glaucoma tip, which is manufactured by Earthly Instruments. It's an inner platinum electrode which is isolated from outer coaxial electrode. The tip is 1 millimeter in length, 0.3 millimeter height, and 0.6 millimeter width, and is bent posteriorly at an angle of 15 degrees. The external diameter is 0.9, so normally when we have to use it stand alone, we can make around 1.2 millimeter opening and use it. This is how the tip looks, and this is how you have this 4 mirror gonio lens which is used along with the tip to perform this procedure, and this procedure hardly takes maybe 4 to 5 5 minutes. The surgical procedure involves a clear corneal incision, which is around, if you are doing it as a standalone procedure, around 1.2 millimeter wide temporal upper incision. A second corneal incision of 120 degrees. Injection of Elon GV is injected into the eye to open up the angle. A probe is inserted through the temporal corneal incision and opposite iridocorneal angle observed by 4 mirror gonioscopic lens is where there is HFDS is done. Tip penetrates up to 1 millimeter nasal into the sclera through trabecular meshwork and Schlepp's canal, forms a deep sclerotomy, which is called thalame, of 0.3 millimeter high and 0.6 millimeter width. The procedure is repeated 6 times with one quadrant. It can always be repeated in another quadrant if the effect is seen to come down. But so far in the studies that have been internationally and the studies that we have done, we have found a reasonably good amount of lowering of the pressure. And at the end of the procedure, sometimes you do get a little bit of bleeding. Elon GP is evacuated and the patient is kept on pilocarpine and other medications for some time. This shows you how temporal, if you're doing it from temporal side, because this is a procedure we normally combine with cataract surgery, and cataracts are done from temporal side. So we make a temporal incision for cataract. At the end of the cataract surgery, you can put pilocarpine and constrict the pupil and inject viscoelastic to open up the angle, and then 6 places one can do it. But this side can be changed from nasal to up or down, depending on the convenience. If you look at this animation, that will exactly show you what we exactly. Now that's the angle where at 6 different points in the trabecular meshwork, this heavy tip is inserted to make that passage between anterior chamber and the Schlemm's canal. If this probe is attached to the cataracts machine, and it can be attached to any of the earthly phaco machines, and this can be used either temporally or from above. First you inject viscoelastic, open up the angle, then you inject a little viscoelastic on the cornea so that your 4 mirror lens can be placed on it. First you place the probe in the angle, then watch it through the 4 mirror, place it exactly closer to and at a level where the trabecular meshwork starts, and inject it or press it into the trabecular meshwork and press on the foot switch. And up to 3 or 4 times you get a small noise, and after that you just take it out and repeat it at 6 different places. And this is how this pressure gradually comes down, and you can always do it with putting anti-glaucoma medications. And this is at the end of the cataract surgery. You wash out the viscoelastic, hydrate the wound, inject pilocarpine, then inject viscoelastic, and this is how you place it first in that area, recheck it with 4 mirror gonial lens, and then after you have done it, change the place, and this is repeated 6 different places. Sometimes the patient may get little pain, so before I start this, I would re-inject intracameral Oculan and then proceed with it. But the pain is not much, so it's quite bearable. And at the end of it, sometimes you may see a bit of bleeding. You wash it, and that's it. It's a simple and a quick procedure, and there's no change in the patient's follow-up regime or in the medication, except that he has to, in addition, to put pilocarpine. This picture shows you how the trabecular meshwork is seen, and this is how, after you have done your HFDS, you see those bubbles, which are signs of application there. And post-op, you can see with a gonioscope, you can also see small passages that are created there. And this is a schematic diagram of HFDS openings where it is done through the trabecular meshwork directly into the Schlemm's canal, and it works well. And this is the SLOCT picture, which shows you how this opening is made from the anterior chamber into the Schlemm's canal. Complications, hypotomy is never seen. Corneal edema, very rarely. Hyphema is pretty common, but it disappears without any extra medications. There is a transient fibrin formation, because patient is put on pilocarpine for 3 to 4 weeks, but it clears with an early post-op period after frequent applications of steroids. We did a study in which we included patients with the age group of 18 to 80, uncontrolled IOP with primary open-angle glaucoma. Non-compliance of patient to medical therapy was one of the main reasons why we took them for this study. Status post any surgical interventions, procedures like patent iridotomy, trabeculectomy, these are the patients that were excluded. The results show that we observed the mean reduction in IOP to 14.7 millimeter Hg at 3 months post-op from pre-op of 20.3, and pre-op 23 patients, that means 76% of patients were on one or more medications, where post-op 23% patients required one medication, 23 didn't require, 76% didn't require any medication. So this in short is the wonderful procedure of HFDS, or high frequency beam sclerotomy, that is possible with the tiny machine like cataracts, and I'm privileged to share this.
Imaging is a fast changing one, and multimodal imaging systems have and with its Spectralis HRA OCT, it has set the best retinal surgeons in the world to talk about his experience of using Heidelberg's combined Spectralis HRA OCT system. Dr. Manish Nagar.
A very good afternoon to all of you. I would like to thank Toshpro for this kind of opportunity. And about 11 years back, that when we got it, the first when it had come, and it's a machine which has been very close to what we do, and the performance it gives is the autofluorescence, OCT, everything on a higher resolution. So now with Spectralis, I think we have a lot more dimensions with that we can do just from one single unit. The amount of information which we can get is tremendous. So I'd just like to take all these images of the same patient, same eye, same pathology together, and it's a vast amount of information that one could use it for diagnosis or for planning treatments otherwise. And here is a simultaneous FA ICG, which is something which, when the HRA had come, was one of the primary features why we were attracted to it, because it was the only machine which could show you the ICG pictures of a quality which you could relate to. All other non-SLO based imaging systems had a ICG as well, but then you could hardly make out any details or any hotspots on that. Well, once you use this, you can see the resolution which would be there as we go over some of these cases. So I'll take you over some of the series that we worked on. This is CSR. I'd like to show you a simultaneous FA ICG picture. This is FA, what you see here, and this is ICG. FA shows you the classic smokestack leak, while the ICG shows you a more generalized pathology which is there in terms of the disruption of the pigment epithelium which is there in these patients. So once you see a later phase, you'll see this defined pathology in terms of the ink blot leak, which of course is not seen very well on ICG because it's a much deeper imaging, and it only shows you what's happening at a deeper level of these. And now you have the opportunity that you see the leak, and then you go at the same time to switch to an OCT, and you can see what's happening at the site of leak on the OCT. So you see the CSR, you also see this pigment, epithelial, small detachments, you see this small clump of pigment. There's a lot of information which you can see now. While locating the leak, you can switch straight to an OCT, which is impossible to do otherwise. So this is a high resolution scan passing through the site of leak, and then you will see that there is, as we pass through the leak, the change is a small pigment epithelial detachment, which is something that we, once we started using this, started noticing in a lot of patients. When you have a CSR leak and you do pass a scan through that, you see a small PED underlying. We still don't know the reasons. CSR has multiple theories, but these things would help us understand more eventually as to what could be the pathology. Here again you have a smokestack leak, seen very well on the FA, and ICG of course shows you the overall area of the pathology, and when you pass a scan right through the center of the leak, you see this small PED. So more and more people are now reporting that these small PEDs are located at the site of leak or just alongside that leak. And we looked at a large series and we found that 30% of these sites showed PEDs, 35% showed irregular RP changes at the site of leak, about 23% showed defects in the RP layer corresponding to the leak. Like you see a PED and then you see a small defect in the PED in some of these cases. So that's how good the resolution of these scans are. So here, once you see magnified, you can see what's happening at the level of the PED. Sometimes you see the leaks underlying a vessel, and then you pass the scan and you can actually see that this convexity which comes in with the vessel override which is there, you can still see a small PED below it, and you see the hump of the vessel. So they are very interesting pictures which come out of examining these cases. They all, a certain percentage also showed hyperreflectivity and OCT corresponding to the site of leak. Now you see a small PED, you see convexity, and you see a hyperreflectivity in this area, like a more viscous fluid possibly in that area. So we still don't know the reasons why in this pathology you see sometimes non-viscous, sometimes viscous, sometimes, but the scans would show you exactly what's happening. There are cases which have two leaks, one a smokestack here and an ink blot here, and both of them show corresponding changes which are occurring at the site of the leaks individually in terms of the RP changes or the pigmentation. So these are high reflective substances seen on the roof of the CSR. So there are a lot of findings which are coming which we never knew before we started using this system. And of course the ICG tells us that there is, in a case like this where the FA would show minor changes as in a resolved CSR, what you see here is a more generalized pathology which over a period of time now we know that the patients who have CSR actually have a more generalized pigment epithelial problem, which is what is leading to these issues. And then there are patients who don't show, obviously, you have a CSR patient comes with a complaint, you do an FA, you don't find a leak, and you don't know how to proceed. And these are patients where we find there's no leak, but then you find these PED areas underlying, which possibly might be areas where the leak had generated and has stopped on its own. But then it's interesting to see that what are the findings in these cases where there's no frank leak on the angiography seen, and the OCT is revealing you some of these pictures. And these are follow-ups where you see how it resolves. You know, a lot of cases the CSR leak resolves, the PED resolves. Sometimes the CSR resolves, but the PED does not resolve. Like a case like this, there's fluid here, there's a PED, the fluid has resolved, but the PED is still stayed. So there's so much variety in the way these things present, and we presented a large data of this 2 years back at the APVRS days. And then there's choroiditis, which is again an interesting area to look at from a combined FA, ICG, OCT perspective. And we looked at a large series of these variety of cases, and the findings you can get in these, like a patient with a serpiginous like choroiditis, what kind of findings you can get on the OCT, as in a deeper imaging you find enhanced depth ability where you can see what's happening at the choroid at a deeper level. So these are cases, if you see FA ICG, you can see that there is still some active areas in the periphery here at the margins. ICG shows those much better as compared to what you see on the FA. So you can actually detect the new areas of where the increase in the choroiditis is happening and decide on treatment patterns. And then we also saw, when we saw these patients with treatment, that these lesions, as they heal, when you give them steroids and they heal, they tend to segment. You have a bigger clump of hypofluorescence, which shows an active patch, and as it heals, it kind of disrupts into smaller segments which are there. And we've noted that in a lot of our cases where the healing is taking place. So here you see resolution of lesion in the FA, but the ICG simultaneously shows you so many dark patches which are which previously was one single big kind of a clump which has segregated in that. And then you also see peripapillary elevation in some of these cases. The disc margins tend to have this increased thickness, and surrounding vitreous there tends to be more turbid. These are also findings that you can see with these high resolution scans. And post-treatment, you can see in the same patient, the thickness has gone down, the vitreous reaction here has gone down to a large extent in these. Hyporeflectivity in the choroidal region in OCT corresponding to the hypofluorescent area. So this is the underlying choroid when you do enhanced depth imaging. And then hypofluorescent dots adjacent to the disc. If you look at these 2-3 dots, this is ICG. And you can see fluorescein is of course much more vocal in terms of a very active lesion, while ICG, all the active areas are seen as fluorescent spots here, but there are some fluorescent dots here just next to the disc. So this is another finding which we were not aware of before. So this is a follow-up of a patient with like a weak edge. You see large blotchy areas of serous collections which are there, disc edema, and as you can see now the healing. These are the small spots that we were talking about next to the disc in the acute phase. This is the acute phase with collections of serous elevations. Now the lesion has healed and these spots also start to disappear from this area. This is again another case where you see large blotchy areas with these small spots which disappear as soon as you give steroids and follow them up. The vitreous also gets cleared in these. Even though choroiditis per se does not have most of the times vitreous involvement, but actually at a level of the resolutions you get on these, you actually see vitreous also localized where it has got more cellular structure. So probably there is some inflammation which hits it in direct connection. And we presented data on this at the International Uveitis meeting in 2011. And then coming to lesions of AMD and IPCVs, where ICG is of course extremely useful when you do combined FA ICG. In a case like this where you have a large collection of blood, and then FA does not show you much except masking, while ICG shows you this cluster of hot spots which is suggestive of a polyp which is there. So this is a situation where especially today's times with AMD, everything being treated with anti-VEGFs, we hardly look at a possibility of a lot of these lesions which are not AMD, actually they are IPCV, which is a variant, and they need to be laser along with anti-VEGF. Anti-VEGF alone will not work, and you'll probably have to give them for a much longer period as monotherapy, and you might still have recurrences. So instead, if you find the polyps on the ICG, you can do a focal laser, or if they are too close or on the fovea, you could do a PDT and give anti-VEGF to get a better effect. And then you can pass scans directly through these areas and to the areas of the polyps to actually see that there is a polypoidal change along with pigment epithelial changes which happen in these cases. So the best part is that what you see on an FA, you see on an ICG, and then straight away at that moment you can switch to areas of interest which could be a polyp, which could be any area in the lesion, and you want a scan passing through that. So that's a tremendous ability that this can do all together. Any other machine you have to do separately an angiography and then come and correlate that point. While here the machine software allows you to exactly pinpoint the location on FA and look at the OCD of that simultaneously. So here, after locating, we could laser and give anti-VEGFs and the lesion started to show resorption. This is another similar situation where we do FA ICG, and you can see very soon on the early phase of ICG a polyp coming up here and here, which FA does not show, because FA would not show you a polyp, which is a more deeper pathology. It's something which fills up and is seen much better on ICG. So this is something very amenable to a laser treatment and would resolve much better if you treat it with a laser and anti-VEGF rather than thinking of it as AMD and just keep pumping injections and will keep recurring most of the time. So the late phase would show you FA like this, which doesn't give you much opportunity to find the lesion per se. While looking at ICG, you know this is where the cluster or the polyps are that can be seen. And when you pass a scan through that, you can see the actual contour of the polyp passing in. So this is an amazing ability that right there, you know, same point on ICG, same point on FA, same point on OCD, what does it show? So it's a great correlation for anything. And lastly, just want to touch upon the NTS segment capability of the Spectralis, which what we are using it for mainly, we've looked at scleral incisions. We do a lot of MIVS surgery, and we looked at scleral incisions because we were interested in looking at how these incisions heal in the real sense. So if you look at this scan passing, you'll see this is what, when it passed through here, was actually showing you the site of this linear incision which is left over post-surgery after our sutureless incisions. So this is what is a still frame of a similar incision on day one with the 25 gauge. You can actually see the slit so well, obliquely placed, that we made during the surgery. And this is after 30 days that you see the changes. This is at day one, this is at 30, how the healing has started to take place here. And we've looked at a series of 23, 25 cases, This is day one. It's a bit diffuse here because immediate post-op there tends to be a little bit of conjunctival chemosis mildly, which doesn't give you clarity on the incision. By day 7, that resolves and you get a very clear incision, and by day 25, you're already losing the area of the incision because it's already healing so well. And we also compared the previous generation of trocars, which were less sharper as compared to the present generation, and you can see the wound which was left over by a previous generation trocar, which used to leave a smiley shaped incision and used to leave was more amenable to leaking or hypotony, while the present linear incisions heal very naturally. You can see that how well opposed the margins of the sclera are after the surgery. And we presented this at the Asia Pacific VR Society in 2011 and then published the data last year in the Asia Pacific Journal as well. So to conclude, combined FA-ICG and high-resolution OCT is a useful tool to connect topographic as well as tomographic CT. So OCT gives you a very anatomical configuration, but it's a still frame that you can get an anatomical look of the tissue or pathology, while the angiography is giving you a bit of a functional element to it, and that too you get in two different wavelengths, an fluorescein as well as ICG, and then you get the anatomical correlation. So when you correlate these three things, I think it opens up a whole new avenue for you to do a lot of research as well as come to conclusions on diagnosis as well as treat the patients in a better way. Thank you very much.
Three things that are on a phaco surgeon's wish list: good followability, excellent chamber stability, and very efficient phaco emulsification. URTI has incorporated all these in its Easy Phaco technology, which sets new standards in phaco emulsification. What is it that makes Easy Phaco technology so unique? To talk about this, let me please invite Dr. Arnab Biswas, a highly skillful phaco surgeon who has achieved formidable reputation for himself as one of the best in the city of Calcutta, a city where he practices his craft. Dr. Arnab Biswas, please.
Probably this is one of my first presentations on phaco. So much words, discussions have been going on about phaco in every conferences. I really couldn't add in more information about the concepts, the technologies that were still there. But I was fortunate enough, and I'm still fortunate enough to be using the Audley EasyTip. And to tell you the truth, this presentation of mine is a way of expressing my gratitude to the technology. It's not a technology, a simple fluid modification in the tip that has revolutionized the way how I do my phacos.